Greetings, everyone. My name is Peter Young, and I'm head of the Committee 100 Asian American Career Ceilings Initiative. And I'm very, very pleased to welcome all of you and our panelists to today's event. For those of you who are not familiar with Committee 100, it was founded 35 years ago by five founders, including I.M. Pei, Yo-Yo Ma, Oscar Tang, Henry Tang, and it was formed after Tiananmen Square at the suggestion of Henry Kissinger, who said you really need to get a group of Chinese American leaders to really focus on US-China relations and relationship, but also the rights of Chinese Americans in this country, both positive and negative. These are our two twin missions. And those of you know, we have a whole variety of programs ranging from conferences, webcasts, a legal defense fund to defend people who are unfairly being discriminated against, et cetera. It is a wonderful organization, and we hope many of you will somehow involved beyond just these webcasts. This particular webcast is, if you can believe it, is the 36th of the Committee 100 Asian American Career Ceilings events that started in April of 2020. We have had leading scholars and researchers, government officials, leaders from industry, different types, millennials, parents. We've had all different angles that we've tried to explore to help people understand what the problem is and what they can do about it. In addition, we've gradually been shifting towards action-oriented, solving the problem kind of activities. So we just had a summit on July 17th, where we gathered leaders trying to solve this issue together to share ideas, but also to start working on new ideas together and separately. So I'm very pleased that we have Jenny Yang as our fireside chat speaker today on the topic of what is the government doing about DEI and Asian American career ceilings. This is the first time we've covered this topic, and it's actually a very, very important topic because there are many, many different sources of solutions to this problem, and the government has an important role. Jenny has had a very, very long career in civil rights and in government. She served in the White House as a deputy policy counsel, as a deputy assistant to the president for racial justice and equity, and was doing that up until March of this year. And I guess is recovering from the experience, right, of being in the White
Yes, for
and
sure.
still looking for that minimum wage, right, per hour, right, that you're working. But I won't read her whole bio because obviously her whole bio is in the invitation that you all responded to. But she has had an extraordinary career, including being chair of the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which, as you know, has a very important role in terms of making sure that there's fairness in the workplace, et cetera. So I can't think of too many people who are more qualified to talk about this topic. Please join me in welcoming Jenny to today's event. Two housekeeping things I just want to say before we start the fireside chat. First of all, we're going to reserve at least 10 minutes at the end for questions from the audience. And the way this works is all you have to do is type in your question in the chat box, and we'll be able to see it. And you can type it anytime you want, since it's helpful to see what they are, so we can gauge how much time to leave at the end for Q&A. And then I will pick questions to pose to Jenny, and Jenny will answer them superbly, right, Jenny? By the way, a very close friend of mine who is a professor at Columbia had a big sign behind his desk. It said, "Please phrase all questions in the form of a compliment." I thought that was an excellent.
It's good
And
life advice.
yeah, exactly. So that's basically it. So we're going to get started. But I really want to get started, and really, Jenny, maybe you can, in your own words, tell us a little bit about your career and experiences relevant to today's topic. Because, a bio is a bio, but it's really not the same as hearing directly from the person about their experiences and along the way. So if you could do that, that would be great.
Sure. Well, thank you, Peter, for having me here today. I want to thank the Committee of 100 for your leadership in advancing issues around career ceilings for Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. These are issues that are near and dear to my heart that I've spent my career working on. I'm sitting here in my faculty apartment at NYU Law School, the same dorm I was in almost 30 years ago when I was a law student, and now I'm teaching employment law. But, right after law school, I worked on garment workers' rights here in New York City. And then I went to the Department of Justice, where I was in the Civil Rights Division, litigating employment discrimination cases against state and local governments. I spent 10 years as a civil rights attorney on behalf of workers, bringing class action, so large systemic cases. And then from there, I went to the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. We have 53 offices. I still say we, even though I've been gone. There are 53 offices around the country where individuals can come forward to file a charge, and the agency will investigate allegations of discrimination. And then I spent some time at a think tank and doing other work, consulting, helping employers advance diversity, equity, inclusion in their own workplace. And then I went back in on day one of the Biden-Harris administration as the director of an agency within the Department of Labor called the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs. It's a lesser known agency that actually covers about 20% of the workforce that work for federal contractors. And the mission of that agency is to enforce anti-discrimination and affirmative action requirements, which means proactive efforts to remove barriers to opportunity for employees of federal contractors. And then I left to go to the White House, where I worked in the Domestic Policy Council, leading a team charged with racial justice and equity. So we were advancing racial justice and equity across the federal government, coordinating the federal government's positions and response on a number of issues. So that, in a nutshell, is my background. But I will say the reason I got interested in this field was because my mother talked to me about discrimination she was experiencing in her workplace. I was just in elementary school, but I saw the way that how she was treated affected her self-esteem and affected her ability to really feel, energized and ready to take on challenges. It really left her frustrated. She felt often, not recognized for her contributions at the work, excluded or given more work. And she eventually, spoke out about that and went back to law school. So she then became a judge. So she has inspired me through my career. But one thing I do remember from when I was little is I told her once I wrote an essay on discrimination. And I thought she was going to be proud that I had written about something she had told me about that was important, but instead she was horrified because we lived in a predominantly white community. I grew up in suburban New Jersey, and she was worried that the teachers would think badly of our family, that we were talking about concepts of discrimination. So she said to me, "Did you use the word racism?" And I said, "No, I think I just said prejudice and discrimination." And so she was somewhat relieved and thought that was better. But what I learned at that young age was that somehow discrimination could impact people so completely in their lives and affect their self-esteem, but somehow you weren't supposed to talk about it. And, my mother went on to actually challenge some of the problems that she saw in her workplace. And I think that very much inspired me to find roles to play to help others, right, who have experienced similar kinds of marginalization and discrimination.
So Jenny, I have an important question I want to ask you first is, so your mother was a judge. By the way, my wife was a judge for a while. Did she make you stand every time she came in the room?
Fortunately, she did not. I think my parents are on the call, so hello. Sue Pai Young, she says Young, or my parents say Young. That is the correct way to pronounce my last name. She served as a judge on the Workers' Compensation Court. My father, Chung Shu Young, is a semi-retired professor from Rutgers.
Okay.
So he would say, my sister was also a lawyer and my mother, and people would say, so how do you handle having three lawyers in the family? And his answer would be, I wash dishes.
Well, all I can say is I'm glad I'm never in the room when you have a family argument with all those. It's got to be a bloodbath. So let's start out with this first question. It's actually an important one because the vast majority of the people who are listening really don't have a good sense for all the different roles that the federal government plays in terms of addressing career ceilings and racial equity. So could you give, a sort of like a 30,000 foot kind of view of where are the key places where the federal government has a role on those two issues?
Yeah, absolutely. So the EOC, which I chaired, is charged with enforcing our federal government's anti-discrimination laws. That includes Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which just celebrated its 60th anniversary this July. And that is one of the primary laws that prohibits discrimination based on race and national origin, also gender and other bases. And that is often the law that is used to tackle discrimination against Asian Americans. Sometimes it might be racially motivated, other times it can be national origin, and it can also involve other bases like sex as well as national origin if, for example, Asian American women are being targeted specifically. So what I've seen over the course of my career is a wide variety of kinds of discrimination against the Asian American community that sometimes can manifest in different ways than other communities. And one is language-based discrimination. So one of the concerns EOC has had sort of long-standing is discrimination in the form of prohibiting people from speaking their native language at work. Sometimes employers have passed English-only rules that require only English be spoken, even on break time. So in one case, EOC worked with now Asian Americans Advancing Justice in Los Angeles to pursue a case against Delano Regional Medical Center. And that involved 70 Filipino American hospital workers who are subjected to harassment and unfair discipline, particularly when speaking with other Filipino workers. Staff were encouraged to act as like vigilantes and like berating Filipino Americans and making fun of their accents, even saying, speak English when someone was speaking English with an accent. So no other groups were actually targeted for speaking other languages. And so that the agency resolved, along with Asian American Advancing Justice, for about $1 million for that group of workers. We've also seen cases involving hiring discrimination, even where Asian Americans are very well represented. So the agency that I more recently led, the Office of Federal Contract Compliance, the way that OFCCP does most of its work is scheduling federal contractors for compliance evaluations. And during those compliance evaluations, the employer needs to provide the agency with significant data on their hiring, on the demographics of who applied, on pay, and then the agency will analyze that data in order to see whether there may be underrepresentation of a particular community. And then we investigate to see whether there's evidence that that underrepresentation is due to discrimination. So it requires proactive barrier analysis by employers. And so during one of these compliance evaluations, OFCCP found underrepresentation of Asian Americans in an engineering classification for Palantir, which is a computer and software services company that works on data analysis. And the agency entered into a consent decree where the company paid over $1.6 million to affected Asian American applicants who were denied opportunities. And, some might say, well, Asian Americans are viewed as good at, computer science, right? The model minority myth, Asian Americans supposed to be good at math. Why would they face discrimination, right? But often stereotypes, we've seen them harm employees in a number of ways, right? Even if workers are seen as technically competent, often there are stereotypes that Asian Americans don't have the soft skills to be able to lead a team or to exercise, independent judgment.
In fact, Jenny, the interesting thing is in a lot of the other events we've had, the data really has come out that surprisingly there's a bigger problem in the technology industry than a lot of other industries, which is, as you said, rather surprising, right? Given the quote stereotype about Asian Americans.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a really good point, Peter, because what we see in the tech industry is Asian Americans are well represented in many of the line positions, right? The line engineering positions. But when you go to higher level management, there's a significant underrepresentation. So EOC recently, just last month, issued a new data analysis looking at the tech industry. They issued a report that's available online for those that are interested, but they confirmed research that I had led during my tenure at EOC that had found similar patterns where Asian Americans are highly represented in certain categories, but very underrepresented at the highest level. So that's a common issue that we see. We also see various kinds of harassment, particularly after the pandemic, and we saw this rise in anti-Asian hate. There was also similar kinds of harassment and that workers experienced. There were also cases where, for example, people would decide that they wouldn't put an Asian American in a customer-facing role because they were concerned that customers may not want an Asian American in that role because of this heightened fear of Asian Americans during the COVID crisis, right? And that is not acceptable. Customer preference is not a defense to discrimination. So thinking that, well, I don't want to put an Asian American in a customer facing role because they might react negatively because the person's Asian American, that is also discrimination.
Like you referenced the EOC because that's one you're quite familiar with it. But what are the different tools they use to identify where the problem is? It sounds like it's partly investigations, partly using data, but also I suspect there's a way in which people can report incidences of so maybe
Yes.
you could say what are the tools, at least that agency, which you're quite familiar with, uses to identify where there's a problem that they need to look into.
Yeah, that's another important question. So there's a complaint process that both EOC has. Individuals can go into any of the 53 offices around the country to meet with an investigator to explain what happened. There's also an online portal where individuals can fill out a questionnaire to explain what happened and then set up an appointment to meet with an investigator either online or in person to then prepare a charge of discrimination if an individual wants to file a charge. So once an individual decides to file a charge, the agency will investigate the charge, will determine whether to interview witnesses, collect documents. The agency notifies the employer that a charge has been filed. It asks the employer a series of questions to explain the employer's position, and then it conducts an investigation and makes a determination as to whether reasonable cause exists to believe that discrimination occurred.
Yeah.
And then the agency will issue a determination and then can pursue cases through litigation or can issue a right to sue for individuals. Whether or not the agency found reasonable cause, individuals can pursue a private right of action in court after the conclusion of the investigation, or they can ask for the right to sue letter after 180 days. And I will just add, there are statute of limitations. It means you only have a certain period of time. It can be either 300 days or 180 in certain states. So it's important that if you have experienced discrimination, you consider whether you want to file a charge soon so that you don't lose your right to actually pursue your legal rights.
Now, what are the other agencies stepping away from the EOC that get involved with, discrimination, et cetera? And obviously, they're also state and local as well, but focusing for the moment on the federal side, what are some of the other agencies or entities that get involved?
So the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, OFCCP, is the other major enforcement agency. You can also file individual complaints with OFCCP if the employer is a federal contractor. And OFCCP will investigate individual charges as well as pursue broader systemic cases. And often some of the larger cases, the agencies might learn about either through an individual charge, could be reading about something or hearing about it in the news media. The EOC can open on its own accord a commissioner's charge. And even if someone is afraid to come forward and put their name on a charge, it could be possible to provide information, and then the agency might act in its own name in a larger systemic issue. So EOC and OFCCP are the major anti-discrimination enforcement agencies in the federal government. Many states have a counterpart, and the agencies work closely together. So EOC and these, we call them Fair Employment Practice Agencies. The city, like City of New York, has one, as well as the state of New York. And there will be work sharing agreements so that an individual can file with one agency and there is an agreement amongst them which agency will take on that investigation. Often you may have stronger protections or better case law at the city or state level than the federal government. So in some states like California, New York, and others, there may be a preference for going in the state or local route rather than the federal route.
Yeah, that's right. And there are some very, very different rules and mechanisms and so forth. One question, with the last couple of years has been really tough if you're Asian American because of this clash between US and China and Asia hate and so forth. Has that altered what the federal government has either chosen to do or has been forced to do related to this? Because clearly the level of discrimination and hate crimes, et cetera, has gone up significantly.
Yeah, so one of the roles that I was playing when I was at the White House was really looking at strategies to strengthen protections against hate crimes, as we saw the rise against the Asian American community, but also many other communities as well, both during and after the pandemic. So the Department of Justice, works with U.S. Attorney's offices around the country to address issues around hate and hate crimes. Another issue that your question kind of makes me think about is some of the challenges that Asian Americans have faced in working for the federal government in national security jobs, some of the targeting of Chinese American scientists and others. And I know Committee of 100 has been very active on these issues, but that is also another area that I've been very concerned about, because in some instances, there's not been strong evidence, right, that a particular individual was a security risk. But I have heard from a number of federal government employees who have been concerned about being denied positions abroad or being denied their security clearance when there isn't a factual reason, but there is a concern about racial profiling of Asian Americans, Chinese Americans in particular, but others as well, because of the concerns about China.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, we had some speakers talk about the fact that in the State Department and other departments, clearly people were being discriminated against in terms of where they were assigned based on race, and that is another form of the problem. Now,
Absolutely.
in addition to
Mhm.
this rise in Asia hate, et cetera, there's this overall hubbub around this whole issue of DEI, affirmative action, you name it, right? And unfortunately, Asian Americans as a group have been dragged into this because some of the cases, like the Supreme Court, was really focused on Asian Americans, et cetera. So, given this hubbub, and there are many, many different parts of this problem, right? And backlash, and then activists going after companies and saying, you know, your DEI programs are discriminatory, also on race and so forth. How do you see the current state of this problem in terms of both career ceilings, DEI, and where do you think it's heading, right? Because that's one of the things that people are really worried about, which is this heading for something really, really bad, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I was very concerned to see both the increasing attacks, politicizing efforts to advance equal opportunity in the political dialogue, even before the Supreme Court's decision in the Students for Fair Admissions case against Harvard and UNC, where the court there really just addressed a narrower question about whether race can be considered as a plus factor among among qualified people to help promote educational diversity. And the reason for the consideration of race in education was to create a more diverse learning environment to benefit all students. And the court was looking at whether the evidence supported a compelling government interest there. And that was a very different question than the issues in employment, where most diversity, equity, inclusion efforts and hiring efforts do not consider race in decision-making at all. And so just as a general matter of law, the Supreme Court decision in higher education actually has no real impact. It does not change the law at all in the employment space. But what it did do is it has emboldened attacks on many programs that companies had put in place or employers to try to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion. And what I do think we'll see is, and what we're seeing already, is a sort of a wholesale reevaluation. Many companies are doing their own audit, both for legal compliance, as well as to understand, what is working and what isn't. The companies that were very committed to advancing equal opportunity and diversity, equity, inclusion are continuing that work. They're moving into more integrated, often, ways of doing that. So they're trying to understand, they're using different language sometimes as they talk about it to try to insulate some of it from attack. But many are not, backing down from this work because they know how important it is to utilize the full talent in America, to fully engage all their employees, and to create a work environment where everyone feels that they truly belong and can contribute, right? There's really strong research there. Companies have seen it. They're not backing away. But what some are doing is where they had programs that were more legally vulnerable, that were limited, there were challenges to some fellowship programs that were limited to certain groups by race. Companies have broadened those. And so instead of limiting programs to only certain communities that were historically underrepresented, they have been broadening it to others who have faced adversity as well, similar to the Supreme Court. So there were many companies, particularly after the murder of George Floyd and the sort of call for greater racial reckoning and addressing some of the systemic and historic inequities. Many companies felt that they needed to do something, but they didn't necessarily have full buy-in to continue that work. And I think some of those companies you see pulling down resources, eliminating positions, advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion. But I do believe there's a strong core of both corporate leaders, civil rights leaders, government leaders who all believe this work is critical. And I do believe it will continue. I think we're going to see the next generation of diversity, equity, inclusion programs. And I welcome, this audience, people that you're working on as a part of that sort of thought partners that will bring that work forward, because it's critical for all communities. And that includes the Asian American community. And I do think it's an important time as companies are reevaluating their work for them to also understand that Asian Americans need to be included in the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, because often companies may not understand the kinds of systemic barriers, particularly in advancing in leadership in professional roles or There's other language access issues and others in other roles that need to be addressed.
It's interesting that we, Committee 100, we had a summit on July 17th, which Jenny, unfortunately, you had a schedule conflict. Otherwise,
Yes, otherwise I would have been there.
but it was an interesting gathering. It was a hybrid, and I'm going to link it to this issue. It was hybrid where we had a lot of people in person who are heads of DEI groups around the country or heads of nonprofits, and then we had attendees, and virtually. But a hot debate was this issue of what can you justify, right? And part of the audience said, well, the studies don't show that diversity improves profitability and so forth. The other said, well, there are 27 studies that show that it does. And it's created a lot of anxiety among companies trying to figure out where they're going to land and what they justify. But a lot of the things they're doing are the ones you mentioned. But I think one thing's for sure, somebody said DEI has become a dirty word, a swear word, right? So a lot of people are just
Has
changing
become the
the name,
boogeyman. Every bad thing
to a
has been
different,
rolled up.
name. It's
It
like
is
every
blamed
company
for
gets in trouble.
any failure, right?
Yeah, they
But
rechange. But
yeah.
so the real question I have for you though is what's going to be the off ramp for a lot of these in terms of being able to defend themselves, right? What's the best defense if they're companies or law firms or CPA firms, if they want to still be committed to diversity, right, in their workforce?
Mhm.
What's the best defense that they can, make to make that argument?
Well, I think there are many things employers can do that are fully lawful, that can include, recruiting more diverse talent, right? So going to sources where you can find people that have traditionally been underrepresented, because often in many industries, positions are filled by word of mouth and social networks, and people who aren't a part of that network are disadvantaged. So you need to surmount that by going out and really finding people, investing in the kinds of training programs that can really help people learn the field, right? There's often unnecessary job requirements. So for example, we had a hearing on this when I was at EOC, and someone testified like, you could require that somebody has this computer program that might take you 2 months to teach someone. And so you've just narrowed down your qualified applicant pool to a group of people who maybe just randomly, fortuitously got to have this training at their last job, but you're excluding people who actually might perform better over the long run and have the skills and abilities if you just invested the 2 months to train them on this particular program, right? So by having requirements that are unnecessary, often they're looking for, 3 to 5 years of experience in exactly our field with our competitors, right? And that's going to create a closed system where new people can't break in. And so I do think it's a time for employers to go back and do the kinds of work that is really the core of equal opportunity, which is understanding what are job-related hiring criteria. How do we do that well? And really communicating at every level what your equal opportunity or diversity, equity, inclusion, or whatever your new words will be, what it actually means. Because sometimes you also see policies being implemented incorrectly. So things like the Rooney Rule or diverse slate, right? I think there's a strong argument it can be done fully lawfully. But if you don't have the real recruitment of diverse talent, you don't have a separation between understanding what people's demographic background is and the selecting officials, you could run into problems. So I think that it's a good opportunity to understand that you can't just set an objective and expect it to filter down, but it's a true like change management strategy where everyone really needs to understand what their role is and how these efforts work to make sure that they're implemented in a way that's fully lawful. Because sometimes they're designed to be fully lawful. There's a problem in the implementation. So I think there is a lot of opportunity to utilize effective practices, right? Where you're moving the needle, and there is increasingly research showing the kinds of practices that can be effective and what may just be more of sort of a window dressing. Like some of the diversity trainings, right? It's like you can't expect much from a one-time training.
Now, before I ask you the next question, I have been alerted by the staff that for some reason the chat function is disabled. So
Oh, okay.
it is not our intention to prevent you from asking any questions from the audience. So we're going to go to Plan B, and that is if you have a question, raise your hand, and I will call on people, not knowing what question you're asked. So please be polite, but then allow you to talk and ask a question. So you can start raising your hand now, and then when we get to Q&A, I'll just randomly select people who have raised their hands. My next question is this. I think it's fair to say that no one believes the federal government is perfect, right? I think everyone, there are obviously some things that the federal government does well in this area, and some things where there are really gaps, either gaps because they don't have programs in place or gaps because they're not well executed. So if we pretend, wave a magical wand and you're now head of this whole shebang in the federal government, what are the gaps that you see that you would like to see filled? And what would those be?
Well, one significant gap is that many workers don't understand their rights, right? And that's why the program that we're doing today is important, and also the kinds of outreach to help people understand what is a violation. So that, there's both, there's a resource gap that can limit the federal government's resources to actually conduct the outreach. There's also gaps in the ability to put the kinds of time into the investigations that come in, and that can be discouraging for people if, there's just such a demand for assistance and not enough resources. So I do think the need to educate workers is critical. When I was at the EOC, we had launched an initiative with also the OFCCP and the National Labor Relations Board through the White House Initiative on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders at that time to go out into communities and we would reach out to the different organizations, particularly serving the Asian American community. We would bring translated materials in many different languages, as well as people who could speak many different languages to listen and to understand what were the workplace challenges that different communities were facing, to share what it was that our agencies did, and to increase people's comfort level with coming forward. So I think in addition, we also need more people who work for the federal government who come from these communities, right? Who understand what the needs are and who can build trust with the communities. Because sometimes what would happen is people would say, well, we don't get a lot of charges from, say, the Hmong community in Minnesota. And then I would ask, well, do we have anyone who knows that community? And they would say, well, the person left and now we don't anymore. Or, there would be those challenges. So it's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we're not able to ensure our federal government is fully representative of all the communities that we serve, then we will not be able to serve those communities well. So that was part of the work that I was leading at the White House on the racial justice and equity initiatives across the federal government. The president signed a day one executive order directing all the federal government agencies to make sure that they were serving all communities, both in, grants, enforcement, and to really understand what were the barriers for certain communities in accessing government services, and then developing a strategic plan that are published on the agency and the White House website explaining what we're doing.
So one question is this, this issue about discrimination, et cetera, there are two sides of it for individuals. There's one, how do they deal with discrimination that they're faced with, right? But the other is, what can people who are concerned about this issue, what can they do as individuals to advance the cause, including organizations they could join or things they could do individually? So, for those people in the audience who on one side say, I'd like to figure out a way that I can help diminish this problem, what are the ways that these individuals could contribute?
Well, that's a really good question. I did want to highlight one initiative that EOC has launched that they're looking for people to engage with, and that is led by Commissioner Kalpana Kodagal. She is a former colleague of mine from our law firm days, but she's a child of immigrants from India, and she's leading this effort to reach vulnerable workers in underserved communities. So they are working to make sure that they are reaching workers who are often most unlikely to seek the agency's assistance. The agency will bring cases on behalf of, for example, trafficking victims from other countries. And I've brought a number on behalf of workers from like Thailand, as well as India. And so that is one effort where they're looking for entities and individuals who want to get involved in helping share that information about what the agency does. There's also, a number of civil rights organizations. Asian Americans Advancing Justice fights for civil rights protections through, education, litigation, and public policy. It's a consortium of a number of organizations. John Yang, who is their executive director, has been a leader in raising concerns about discriminatory racial profiling against Asian Americans in the federal government. There's also the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund in New York City, the Asian Law Caucus in San Francisco. So there's some of the Asian American legal organizations. There is a newer organization, some might be on the call today, Stand with Asian Americans, which is the first legal civil rights organization focused primarily on fighting anti-Asian workplace discrimination. And their goal is to help Asian Americans, find lawyers and be empowered to speak up without fear of retaliation, because often there is a gap in terms of the resources available. Individuals often they can come to EOC, but if individuals want to find their own lawyers, that can also, can take resources, and that can be a challenge. So I was really happy to meet recently with Justin Zhu and Brian Pang, who's their CEO. Justin's one of their founders. Michelle Lee is their president. Another group I'll mention is the Asian American Scholars Forum. And that is also a relatively new organization. I think maybe about 2000 it started to bring together particularly scientists, right, who have faced targeting, particularly as Chinese American scientists and others felt the chilling effect of the China initiative, which has now been eliminated, to advocate those concerns. So
By the way,
people,
it
yeah.
just restarted, by the way. I'm sorry to say, but certain elements have been restarted. So
Yes, I know there are many
like
proposals in
Frankenstein
Congress
come to
as
life.
well. Yeah.
Brian, you mentioned Brian Pang, and I do believe that Brian is actually in the audience. If it's the same Brian Pang,
Oh,
welcome.
terrific.
We've chatted before, and your work is fantastic.
Well, yeah, I'm really excited because there is a gap in terms of getting legal resources. So I'm really glad that organization is leading the way. And then I'll just mention one more, which is this Asian American Federal Employees for Non-Discrimination, or AFEN. Ariana Yang is one of the co-founders, and they have been working to organize the federal government workers who have faced discrimination in the workplace to change, background check policies and other things. So those are a few resources and organizations that are available looking for people interested in these issues to join in.
Now, I'm really confused now because we had a whole bunch of hands that were raised, and now it's gone back down to one. So now I don't even have to make a decision. I'm going to call on Jingli Yu, and I'm going to allow you to talk. And please direct a question.
Hi, Peter. Hi, Jenny. Thank you so much for holding this webinar. So I guess since I'm the only one, maybe I can ask two related questions then. So Jenny, as you've mentioned, EOC had recently issued a report showing that there is a gap between the representation of Asian Americans in in big tech or just in tech in general, in the management ranks versus workers. It's also an issue that SWAA has been flagging. It's also an issue that 80/20, which is the organization I belong to, has been flagging specifically with regard to Meta, I want to ask, how can we as Asian Americans induce the government to investigate systemic discrimination in these big tech companies against Asian Americans? That's number one. Relatedly, you said you just told us that OFCCP allows individuals to file complaints with them. Do you know if um, the big tech companies are all federal contractors? So, like, would they be subject to OFCCP's jurisdiction?
Yeah, many of the big tech companies are federal contractors. OFCCP has actually brought and resolved quite a number of large pay discrimination cases, and a number of them did include Asian Americans in the tech sector. So often there's occupational segregation, almost like micro segregation too, where like depending on the particular position in line, you can have different demographics and different pay, which then can drive sort of broader pay disparities. So I do think there is significant interest in understanding and addressing the issues in the tech sector. I think what's most helpful to the federal government is people willing to come forward to explain what's happening so that the federal government can understand what if there is a broader pattern or practice. And as I mentioned earlier, even if the individuals aren't willing to file a charge, as long as there's enough information for the agency to want to open a commissioner's charge on its own initiative, one of the commissioners can do that. And I know there is interest generally in those issues.
Yeah, and it certainly doesn't help that Asian Americans as a group tend to not speak up, right? And not to complain. And that's a problem because if
Yeah,
you don't let the government and authorities know that there's a problem, they may not know. So
yeah. And it is actually a priority that's been identified in EOC's strategic enforcement plan, is addressing discrimination, particularly in growing sectors, including the tech industry. So it is one of their priority areas.
yeah. Okay. Wow, we lost all the other questions. Any other questions? Or anyone wants to make a statement? Brian Pang, do you want to make a statement to, since you've been lauded by Jenny? If so, raise your hand. Oh, there we go. We got a question here. All right. All right. I thought if I cajole people, they will finally go ahead.
Okay. Can we expect the equal response from the federal government under different administrations?
No. There's very different views of equal opportunity work depending on the administration. So you will see significant changes when the administration change, if there, when the administration has changed in the past. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission is an independent agency with a 5-member bipartisan commission. So it has tended to swing in the past a little bit less than some of the other executive branch agencies. So whoever is president appoints the chair, and typically you would have the majority to vote on guidance and cases and other things. So we did see during the Trump administration some very significant changes.
All right, we're on a roll now. Shudo, you started momentum. Michelle Lee, it's your turn.
Hi, this is Michelle Lee. I'm the president and general counsel of Stand with Asian Americans. Jenny, thank you so much for shouting us out. And, we just wanted to let everyone know that we're here to serve the community in a pretty unique way, in the sense that, we want to bring, lawsuits and legal claims and take consequential actions to hold companies accountable, employers accountable when they discriminate against members of our community. Yeah, we definitely want to go beyond just, making statements or symbolic gestures to take lawsuits to the next level. all of the board members of Stand with the Asian Americans have, on our personal capacity, have brought claims against our respective former employers. And so we are very personally, aware of all the issues that are involved. And yes, just reach out to us. One other request is that we are looking to hire legal directors. So if you know of anyone who would be interested in joining our mission, please refer them to us as well. I wasn't sure if Brian was going to speak, so I just jumped in here. Okay, thank you.
There we go. Brian, I'm going to push you ahead of the line because it's been mentioned, and Michael and Tiffany, you'll go next. So Brian, please.
Thank you so much, Peter, Jenny, C100 for spotlighting this topic, and Michelle for speaking as well. Jenny, thank you for shouting out Stand with Asian Americans. And we know that these civil and constitutional rights exist for all, but Peter, you called it out too, is we don't always exercise them as Asian Americans.
Right.
So exist and this stage as well, all the work that you're doing with Asian American career ceilings and all the work that we're doing in Stand with Asian Americans, we're really here to provide that platform and support for anyone who wants to speak up and take action. So please do reach out to us, and we'll happily work with you and partner with you and share more about our work and also support you through your journeys.
Yeah, Brian is doing amazing stuff. So I'm going to twist his arm and get him to be on one of these panels. But I tried, right, for July 17th, but it didn't work with your schedule. So I'll keep on trying. I'm very persistent.
Yeah, and I just want to thank Michelle, Brian, and all of you who have been organizing, because it can be really debilitating to face discrimination, right? And often people who I've represented, they feel like they did something wrong, right? It's almost embarrassing that this happened to you. And what was it about me that caused this to happen? And that's why it's so important to have organizations to support people. And that's why it's important for the government to come forward too, to say, it's not you, right? You were harmed by discrimination, and we're going to make that right. So thank you for all the work that you're doing to lead that effort.
So the next one up is Michael.
Hello. Thanks for putting this panel on. So I have a question at a more kind of individual level. If someone finds themselves at one of these tech firms or a financial services firm, and they see kind of this discrimination take place, or other people, getting ahead or having difficulty breaking into that senior management rank, what does taking action look like? And what can the results be? Is it, a lawsuit for settlement, a formal complaint to HR, and is filing an action, career ending at that company or even in the industry? So just, general topics around that at a more individual level would be helpful.
Sure. It is very individualized, right? The type of risk people are willing to take and what the situation is in terms of how a company might respond to an informal concern that's raised. So I'm not giving any legal advice, but there are various options, right, for individuals. And one is really trying to understand the experience that others are having, because there is some safety in numbers. There's increased ability to show a pattern. So it becomes harder for an employer to say, well, it was because you didn't have these qualifications, or right, to make it just about one person, when you can demonstrate that there are a number of people who had a similar situation happen and they were treated less favorably than others, and they're all Asian American, right? It becomes more likely that race was taken into account, right? Because often the practices are fairly subtle. So that's, I was a class action attorney in part because, right, there is that ability to look at broader data sets and information. So where you have the ability to try to collect a broader set of experiences or evidence or data to demonstrate a broader pattern, that information can be very interesting for federal or state or local enforcement agencies to look at. You can always consult with an attorney to understand whether the pattern or situation that you're seeing is likely to be an actionable claim. It's always good to investigate, what your informal options are, Because sometimes a good company who is trying to be proactive, that learns of a problem or a widespread concern, sometimes there are affinity groups, right? That could be a place that's a safer place to talk about the issue, where someone in a more senior role that feels comfortable can raise an issue on behalf of others that might feel more vulnerable. Sometimes there are diversity, equity, inclusion committees or, sets of structures where people can, on a more confidential basis, raise it. There is just a challenge with the formalized grievance procedures where you file complaints and accuse people of discrimination. That is the process that you need to use to exercise your federally protected rights. But there is quite a bit of research where individuals can face retaliation, even though it's prohibited by law. So it's helpful before taking action to really understand what your options are and to position yourself so that you're in the strongest position that you can be, right? Where there is strong evidence. Sometimes the company wants to address it voluntarily. Other times a lawyer can write a demand letter or something that's not short of filing an action that is raising attention to an issue. So there are a variety of different approaches, but it is important to really try to think through what those options are and what would work best in a particular situation and an individual's comfort level, because there can be repercussions within an organization. So those are something people need to consider and to protect themselves against.
Now, Tiffany Coe will get the last question, but before that, I just want to remind people of upcoming events under the Committee 100 Asian American Career Ceilings. The next one is on November 6th at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, and that's going to be Committee 100 Asian American Career Ceilings, a look at women in media and in music. So that'll be interesting. Then the one after that is a very special event that we're having, which is on November 14th from 6 to 7:15 p.m. Eastern. And that's going to be a virtual advice and networking event. And what we're doing is we're recruiting a number of people who are experienced in different fields, particularly, but this time we're going to focus on finance, investing, and consulting. And then we're going to invite all of you, and anyone who wants to join, in order to sit at electronic tables and meet with these sort of experienced advisors, ask questions, and get to know people. And the last for individuals is that we're going to start a tutoring series or an instructional series. Jenny and I are working on one for corporates and DEI, but it hasn't been set yet. But one for individuals, we're going to have one on C100 Asian American Career Advice, Overcoming Bias and Stereotypes. And we're going to have 3 people who are the instructors, one does research on the issue, one who is an advisor, and one who is an experienced person who faced the stereotyping bias in their career and fought their way through it successfully, but had some lessons from that experience. So those are 3 of the upcoming events for the Committee 100 program. And now I'm going to let Tiffany ask the last question.
Thank you for that. I actually agree with all the comments that have been made that it's actually very difficult for us as a community to speak up for ourselves. So I was just wondering, for all the cases that have been formally brought forth, what has the success rate been? Because that could, if we've actually had really good success rate, that could be an encouragement for the people that's on the fence to get off the fence and actually, bring forth their case or their discrimination circumstances.
Well, it is highly variable, dependent on the facts, the court. So it is hard to say, X% success rate, in general, but I do think it is worth thinking through different strategies, right, to try to raise these issues within an organization, whether it be informal or more formal. And I think now is a good opportunity as companies rethink, right? And they're really in this process of what does it mean to advance diversity, equity, inclusion? And I think it's very important to these organizations to understand the issues impacting the Asian American community, and for employees being willing to do that in a variety of different ways, right? Some can be collaborative and helpful, others can be raising concerns or filing a complaint or a lawsuit where that's necessary.
Yeah, and I want to make one other comment, which is over and over again, over the 36 or so events that we've had, the importance of finding mentors, and not Asian American, but just mentors, right? Who can help you is very important. Most people think of mentors in terms of getting advice for people who can, help you succeed. But it's the other side too, which is if you have a mentor and you've got an issue about discrimination, so forth, it's very helpful to have someone in the organization who can help at least see what they can do about solving the problem. I think that's a very important thing. So we're going to end on time, but my last comment has nothing to do with career ceilings and the federal government. We are heading for elections in early November, and whether you're talking about the presidential election or governorship, so forth, this is an election where so many of the races are very, very close at all different levels. And what that means is Asian Americans proportionally have more of a say than they had a lot of other elections.
Yeah.
And my comment is not who to vote for, whatever. It's just exercise your right. And
Yeah.
not only that, it's particularly nice when you feel that your vote may count more in this election than it may have in other elections. So please make sure that you exercise your right, whatever your belief is, and whoever your candidate is, not the issue. The issue is for democracy to succeed, you need to exercise your right. And this is a particular time where smaller groups like Asian Americans will have more clout and will determine more of the outcome than they have in previous elections.
Yeah. And we need to exercise our voice so that the needs of the community are prioritized. So thank you all. Really appreciate your taking the time to join us tonight.
So
And
I
thank
want
you,
to end
Peter,
by
for
just
putting this
saying,
on.
first of all, thank you very much, Jenny, for your insights during this thing. And I want to thank all of you in the audience. And I got to tell you, I'm actually happy that the chat function failed, because it was nice to hear the voices of the people behind the questions. So thank you very much. And we all look forward to seeing you at our next events.
Great to see you. Thank you. Bye-bye.